This is the story of Dana Satterfield, a young mother from Roebuck, South Carolina, and the unbelievable chain of events that brought her killer to justice. Dana Satterfield was born on November 16, 1967. She grew up in a warm, religious family right in the heart of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Everyone who knew Dana said the exact same thing. She was kind, easy to love, and the type of person who would drop everything to help a friend in need. Dana had a passion for the beauty industry, and right after high school, she trained to become a hairstylist. She worked hard, saved her money, and eventually opened her very own beauty salon in the nearby town of Roebuck. By the summer of 1995, Dana was 27 years old. She was happily married to a man named Mike, and together they had two beautiful children, an 8-year-old daughter named Ashley and a 6-year-old son. Dana was incredibly busy, balancing the chaotic life of raising two young kids while putting all her energy into running her new business. On the night of July 31st, 1995, everything changed. At around 8:30 p.m., the local police received a frantic emergency call. The call came from a woman named Diane, who sold cleaning products and frequently walked around the area. Diane told the dispatcher something truly disturbing. She had been standing near Dana's salon, waiting for a ride, when she heard strange, muffled sounds coming from inside the building. The lights inside the salon were turned off, which was unusual, but Diane could hear dull thuds and banging noises against the walls. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the air. Right before Diane's eyes, a man shattered the window and jumped out into the night. Diane knew Dana well. In fact, just 2 hours earlier, around 6:30 p.m., Diane had actually gone into the salon to sell Dana some cleaning supplies. Then, only 20 minutes before the crash, Diane had passed by the salon again. At that time, the lights were still on, and she saw Dana inside, cleaning up and getting ready to close. Dana had even smiled and waved to her through the glass. Seeing the lights suddenly turn off and a strange man leaping out of the window filled Diane with panic. She thought someone had broken into the shop. Since she didn't have a mobile phone, she ran as fast as she could into a nearby store to call 911. But as she ran inside, she noticed something terrifying. The exact same man who had just jumped out of the salon window was walking right behind her. He walked into the store, looked Diane dead in the eye, and then quickly turned around and vanished. A police officer who happened to be patrolling nearby arrived at the salon within minutes. He expected to find a typical messy burglary scene. He turned on his flashlight and stepped through the broken window. At first glance, everything in the front room looked normal. The cash register hadn't been touched, and the salon equipment was in place. But when the officer walked into the small back break room, he found a scene straight out of a horror movie. Dana Satterfield was on the floor. Her clothes were partially torn, and her body was covered in deep scrapes and bruises. But the most horrifying detail was a belt tightly wrapped around her neck. The other end of the belt had been tied to a large water heater, leaving her body partially suspended. The officer immediately called for backup. Investigators rushed to the scene and locked down the area. Because Roebuck was such a small town, the detectives recognized Dana right away. The state of her clothing suggested she had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. Detectives quickly ruled out a robbery. Money was still in the register, and valuable salon tools were left completely untouched. This wasn't a random theft gone wrong. This was an incredibly brutal, deeply personal attack. While forensic technicians searched every inch of the salon for fingerprints and DNA, detectives focused on Diane, their only eyewitness. Because she had crossed paths with the killer a second time inside the store, she had gotten a brief but clear look at his face. Working closely with a police artist, Diane helped create a composite sketch. The suspect was described as a young, white male, about 5 feet 9 inches tall, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and blue jeans. Even though Diane knew almost everyone in the area from her job selling supplies, She told police she had never seen this man before in her life. Police printed hundreds of copies of the sketch and flooded the streets, showing it to store owners and pedestrians, but no one could identify the face. Detectives mapped out a timeline of the murder. Dana's last official client had left the salon hours earlier. Based on Diane seeing Dana waving happily at 8:10 p.m. and the 911 call coming in at 8:30 p.m., the killer had a tiny window of time. He must have entered the salon immediately after Diane passed by, caught Dana completely off guard, locked the door, and attacked her. Back at the crime scene, forensic technicians made a major breakthrough. On the smooth metal surface of the water heater, right where the belt had been tied, they found a single, clear fingerprint. Because the killer had to use force to tie the belt, investigators were highly confident that this print belonged to the murderer. Standard police procedure meant looking at the people closest to the victim first. Detectives discovered that Dana and her husband, Mike, had recently started living separately due to marital problems, though they hadn't filed for divorce. Police asked Mike to come down to the station to provide his fingerprints. When the lab compared Mike's prints to the one on the water heater, they found an exact match. It looked like an open and shut case. But as detectives began to interrogate Mike, his story completely checked out. On the night of the murder, Mike was at home watching their two children. Detectives interviewed the kids, who were 8 and 6, and both firmly confirmed that their father had been with them the entire evening and had never left the house. Furthermore, Mike did not look anything like the sketch or the witness description. Mike was a very large, heavily built man. The idea of him sprinting and nimbly leaping through a small, shattered salon window simply didn't make physical sense. Dana's family and close friends also backed Mike up. They explained that while the couple was having a rough patch and living apart, they were still on good terms and were actively trying to repair their marriage for the sake of their children. There was no bitter anger or history of violence. To prove his innocence completely, Mike volunteered to take a polygraph test, which he passed with flying colors. He explained to detectives that he was the one who had personally installed that water heater in the salon, and he frequently went there to do maintenance and repair work. The mystery print made perfect sense, and Mike was officially cleared as a suspect. Shortly after, the forensic lab discovered a second fingerprint inside the salon. This print was left in wet blood. DNA testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Dana, meaning the killer had definitely left this print behind during the struggle. Detectives ran the print through local and state databases, but it came back with 0 matches. The killer had no criminal record on file. When the autopsy report arrived, it revealed the true extent of the violence Dana faced. She had been severely beaten, suffering multiple blunt force traumas to her face and body before being strangled to death. The medical examiner confirmed the sexual assault and successfully recovered a clean sample of the attacker's DNA. Today, police can upload a DNA profile into a massive national database like CODIS and get a match in minutes. But back in 1995, the FBI's national DNA database was not fully operational. Police couldn't just upload the sample. The only way to find a match was to manually collect DNA swabs from specific suspects and compare them one by one in a lab. Days turned into weeks. Police tested several local men who fit the general description, but every single lab test came back negative. Then a new witness came forward. A man named Ken contacted the police with a strange story from the night of the murder. Ken explained that at around 8:40 p.m. on July 31st, he drove past Dana's salon. He noticed the building was dark, but Dana's car was still parked outside. What really caught his attention, though, was a blue and white Ford Bronco parked next to a neighboring business. Ken actually worked at that neighboring business and knew for a fact it had been closed for hours. Standing right next to the Bronco was a young man who looked incredibly nervous. As Ken drove past, the man stared at him with a tense, aggressive glare. This happened just 10 minutes after the 911 call, meaning this man was almost certainly the killer fleeing the scene. Now, police had a vital clue, a blue and white Ford Bronco. They began tracking down every single registered owner of a blue and white Bronco in the county. They interviewed dozens of drivers, but without a specific license plate or a DNA match, they couldn't tie anyone to the crime. Months slowly rolled into years, and the investigation ground to a total halt. The case went completely cold. The residents of the small town lived in fear, knowing a monster was walking among them. Every time a local resident saw a blue and white Bronco, they would call 911, but every lead turned out to be a dead end. Dana's children grew up watching the roads, pointing out Broncos to their father, hopping to find the person who took their mother away. Nearly a year after the murder, the police received a sudden phone call from a local jail. An inmate claimed that his cellmate, a man named Russell Quinn, had been bragging about the murder. According to the informant, Russell kept a photograph of Dana in his cell, constantly talking about how beautiful she was, and eventually confessed that he was the one who killed her. Detectives immediately pulled Russell Quinn's file. He was currently in jail for an entirely separate sexual assault. When detectives looked at the details of that assault, their jaws dropped. Russell had tied his previous victim to a tree using a makeshift restraint. This mirrored the unique way Dana had been tied to the water heater. To make things even more shocking, Russell owned a vehicle that matched the description, and his face looked incredibly similar to the composite sketch. Detectives put Russell's photograph into a photo lineup and showed it to Diane, the original eyewitness. Without hesitation, Diane pointed directly at Russell Quinn's face and said, "That's him. That's the man I saw jumping out of the window." Everything was lining up perfectly. The police felt they finally had their man. They rushed Russell's DNA to the lab for emergency testing. But a few days later, the results came back and completely crushed the investigation. Russell Quinn's DNA was a definitive negative match. It didn't match the evidence found on Dana's body at all. Despite the jailhouse rumors, the vehicle, and the eyewitness identification, science proved he was innocent of this specific crime. Just like that, the best lead the police ever had evaporated into thin air. A decade passed, 10 long years of silence. Dana's daughter, Ashley, was now 18 years old and attending college. She looked remarkably like her mother. One afternoon in 2005, Ashley took her car to a local auto shop for a routine, ordinary oil change. While Ashley was standing outside in the parking lot waiting for her car, one of the mechanics working under the hood looked over at her. He stopped in his tracks, turned to his coworkers and said, "Wow, that girl looks exactly like Dana Satterfield, the woman who was murdered 10 years ago." His coworker looked up and replied, "That is Ashley. That's Dana's daughter." The mechanic, a man named Michael, went completely pale. He was utterly stunned. He had no idea Dana had children, let alone that they were growing up right here in the community without a mother. Seeing Ashley face to face triggered a massive wave of guilt that Michael had been carrying deep inside his chest for an entire decade. Michael didn't have anything to do with the murder, but he knew something. In fact, 10 years earlier, when he was just a 17-year-old high school kid, Michael had actually called the police anonymously. He had given them the name of a friend named Jonathan Vick, stating that Jonathan might be the killer. Back in 1995, when the police received that anonymous call, they did a quick check on Jonathan Vick. They discovered that Jonathan was also 17 at the time, and his mother happened to own a blue and white Ford Bronco. Even more suspicious, Jonathan had been driving that exact Bronco on the night of the murder. But when investigators went to Jonathan's house in 1995, they ran into a brick wall. Jonathan's mother fiercely protected her son. She flatly refused to let officers speak to Jonathan, blocked them from looking at the Bronco, and ordered them to leave her property. Because the police only had a single, anonymous phone call with no secondary evidence, a judge refused to sign a search warrant for Jonathan's DNA or fingerprints. Without a warrant, The police had no legal right to force the issue, and they were forced to walk away. Jonathan Vick slipped through the cracks. But now, seeing Dana's daughter standing in his auto shop, Michael realized he couldn't keep quiet anymore. He called the police again. This time, the detectives told him straight out, an anonymous tip isn't enough. It wasn't enough 10 years ago, and it isn't enough now. If you want us to catch this guy, you need to step up, put your name on an official statement, and look us in the eye. Michael took a deep breath, conquered his fear, and agreed. He went down to the police station and gave a detailed, official statement on the record. Michael explained that on the night of July 31st, 1995, his friend Jonathan Vick gave him a ride home in his mother's blue and white Ford Bronco. During the drive, Jonathan randomly turned to Michael and said he was planning to go down to Dana's beauty salon to get his hair cut. Michael thought this was highly unusual because it was already late in the evening and the salon was closing. But Jonathan snapped back and said he wasn't really going there for a haircut. He was going there for Dana. Jonathan and his mother had been to the salon multiple times before, so Jonathan knew Dana well. Jonathan then started talking about how beautiful Dana was and explicitly stated that he wanted to have sex with her. Since Jonathan was only 17 and Dana was a 27-year-old married mother, Michael thought his friend was just talking tough and playing a joke. Michael smirked and laughed it off. Jonathan took Michael's reaction incredibly poorly. He became angry, glared at Michael, and hissed, "You don't think I can do it? Just watch me." Michael dropped the subject, got out of the car, and went home. The very next morning, the news broke that Dana Satterfield had been brutally murdered inside her salon. Michael was in total shock, but initially forced himself to believe it was just a horrible coincidence. But a few days later, when the police publicly announced they were looking for a blue and white Ford Bronco, Michael's heart sank. He realized his friend was a murderer. When Michael tried to subtly bring it up, Jonathan looked at him with cold, dead eyes and threatened to murder Michael and his entire family if he ever breathed a word to anyone. Terrified for his life, Michael only felt safe making that single anonymous call, which ultimately led nowhere. But 10 years later, seeing the face of the daughter who grew up without a mother gave Michael the courage to finally do the right thing. With Michael's signed, official eyewitness statement on their desks, detectives went straight back to a judge. This time, the judge didn't hesitate. He signed a legal warrant to forcibly collect Jonathan Vick's DNA. By 2005, Jonathan Vick was 27 years old. He was living in Greenville, South Carolina, about a 30-minute drive from the original crime scene. He had spent 2 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, was married, and had a young daughter of his own. On the surface, he was trying to live a normal life, but he had a dark, volatile personality. He couldn't hold down a steady job, constantly getting fired for picking explosive fights with coworkers and screaming at his bosses. He also had a history of arrests for domestic violence and vandalism, though those specific charges had been dropped. Police tracked Jonathan down, served the warrant, and took a swab of his DNA. They sent it to the forensic lab, where scientists compared it directly to the decades-old biological evidence preserved from Dana's body. It was a flawless, undeniable match. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was 1 in billions. Detectives moved in immediately and placed Jonathan Vick under arrest for the murder and sexual assault of Dana Satterfield. As officers walked to handcuff Jonathan past a crowd of news reporters and flashing television cameras, Jonathan put on an act. He looked into the cameras and shouted, "I love my wife and my daughter. That's all that matters." During hours of intense police interrogation, Jonathan completely denied everything. He claimed he had never set foot in the salon that night, didn't know who Dana Satterfield was, and had absolutely no explanation for how his DNA ended up at the crime scene. But science doesn't lie. With Jonathan behind bars awaiting trial, detectives pieced together the horrifying reality of what happened during those 20 minutes on July 31st, 1995. Jonathan drove his mother's blue and white Bronco and parked it a block away next to a closed business so nobody would see it outside the salon. He walked up to the door right after Diane had passed by. He used the excuse of a late haircut to get Dana to let him inside. Once inside, Jonathan made aggressive sexual advances. Dana, shocked and uncomfortable, firmly rejected him and told him to leave. That rejection triggered something monstrous inside the 17-year-old. Jonathan snapped. He walked over to the front door, locked it from the inside, turned off the main lights so nobody outside could see in, and launched a vicious attack. Dana fought back with everything she had, but Jonathan brutally beat her until she lost consciousness. He then dragged her helpless body into the dark back break room, sexually assaulted her, took off his belt, and strangled her to death, tying the other end to the water heater. But Jonathan made one critical error. While he was in the back room, he heard Diane outside trying to look through the windows and hearing the thuds. Panic seized him. Instead of walking out the front door like a normal person, his adrenaline-fueled panic forced him to smash open the window and leap out into the alleyway. That single, bizarre decision was exactly what caught Diane's attention and caused her to call 911 immediately. As prosecutors built their case for the upcoming trial, detectives kept digging into Jonathan's past, uncovering an even deeper, darker secret. They discovered that in 2002, 3 years before his arrest, Jonathan had been in a volatile relationship with a young woman named Heather Sellers. The two had actually gotten engaged. But in the fall of 2002, Heather realized Jonathan was abusive and officially called off the engagement. Just 2 weeks after breaking up with him, Heather Sellers vanished without a trace. The police investigation back in 2002 revealed that Jonathan had refused to leave Heather alone. The very last night she was ever seen alive, witnesses saw Heather and Jonathan drinking together at a local bar. After that night, Heather disappeared from the face of the earth. A few weeks later, dive teams found Heather's car sitting at the dark bottom of a local river. But when they pulled the vehicle up, Heather's body was not inside. Heather's family told police that Jonathan had been incredibly abusive and controlling, and he was the prime suspect in her disappearance. However, without a body or physical evidence, the police couldn't prove he was responsible, and no charges were ever filed. While Jonathan was sitting in jail, waiting for his murder trial to begin, his new jailhouse cellmate contacted detectives with a stunning update. The cellmate claimed Jonathan had been talking in his sleep and packing the cell. One day, Jonathan turned to the cellmate and confessed to the salon murder. He admitted he parked his car far away so it wouldn't be spotted and confirmed he broke the window and jumped out because he was absolutely terrified of getting caught. In November 2006, the murder trial finally began. Jonathan Vick sat at the defense table dressed in a suit, maintaining his innocence. But the prosecution's case was an absolute mountain of ironclad evidence. They presented the DNA match, the bloody fingerprint, Michael's powerful testimony, and the testimony of the jailhouse cellmate. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. They returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder and special circumstances. The judge sentenced Jonathan Vick to life in prison. As the handcuffs were slapped back onto his wrists, Jonathan broke down into tears, sobbing openly in front of the courtroom. He yelled at the judge, claiming that the real killer was still out there walking the streets and that true justice hadn't been served. Because of the laws in place at the time of the crime, Jonathan Vick technically retains the right to apply for parole, with his very first eligibility date set for the year 2035. However, it is highly unlikely he will ever see the outside of a prison cell. While serving his sentence, Jonathan's violent nature flared up again. He brutally attacked a prison correctional officer, earning himself an additional 3 years on top of his life sentence. This violent behavior will weigh heavily against him in any future parole hearings. Shortly after his conviction, Investigators searching through old properties tied to Jonathan made one final, chilling discovery. They located an old, abandoned car registered under Jonathan's name. Inside the trunk, forensic technicians discovered strands of hair and deep, dark stains that strongly appeared to be dried blood. Unfortunately, due to the degradation of the material over time, there wasn't enough viable DNA to get a clean profile. Despite the lack of a legal match in the trunk, detectives firmly believe that car is the key to Heather Seller's disappearance. Dana Satterfield was the only victim Jonathan Vick was ever convicted of killing, but investigators remain convinced she was not his only target. Thanks to a routine oil change, a brave witness who conquered his fear, and the undeniable power of modern DNA science, a cold case that slept for a decade was finally solved. Dana's children, Ashley and her brother, finally got the closure they deserved, and a dangerous predator was permanently removed from the streets.